Okay, we're back. At least if you're a returning listener. If not, welcome. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. How is everyone? Is everybody doing okay? Are you settled into your drive or your breakfast? You got your coffee or your tea next to you? Is everybody good to go? Me, I am in my attic on a Saturday late afternoon this week. Sort of been the time I've been doing it these days. Seems like my neighbor starts mowing his lawn right before I do it every time, but hopefully that's not coming through right now. I am happy to be with you. I have a very fun talk today on the Wim Hof Method with my friend Dan Coniglio. I will tell you about that in just a moment. But first, I thought we could have a bit of a check-in. And if you are a new person, this is part of the show. Sometimes we do like a little check-in in these intros and outros. And if you're not interested, you can just skip on ahead. But for everybody else, I thought we could touch base because I've been having a number of things going on with me. And those of you who've been around for a long time know that in the past I used this show as a place for me to speak about things and work through things that maybe are sometimes like a little bit taboo or sometimes a little bit, I don't know, risky. Mostly just for me on a personal level. It's about being transparent with aspects of myself that I would normally hide as a way to help myself grow. There's really two things that I'm thinking of. One is coming out of last week's talk. I don't know if you listened to it. Shara Carruthers was here, and we were talking about Ayurveda, and we were talking about the choices that we make, particularly around food, and how those choices shape who we are in the world. But then we were also talking about how it's not just food, and it's more than that. Well, all of that got me thinking. And I started to do an account of all of the inputs, like all the things that I'm putting into my body or onto my body. And I thought that I had pretty much covered all that. I've done food, and in terms of movement and what I do with my body and being aware of that, I pretty much wouldn't have thought there was anything that I was not aware of that I was doing. But it turns out I had one really big blind spot. And it's sort of a strange thing to admit, but basically I've been using an aluminum-based antiperspirant for the last 25 years or whatever, like more, my whole adult life. And I've never thought to question that or to look for an alternative. And in really looking at that, I figured out why. You see, I can't identify exactly when it happened, but someone, I think it was my dad, but it might have been someone else, some like adult person when I was at a young age, I don't know how old, made a comment about people who stink and how you have to use antiperspirant because deodorant doesn't work. And so that idea got burned into my brain, I think. So sort of unconsciously, I've carried that all of these years. And the craziest thing is it took me all of a week and a half to find a totally natural alternative that works just as good. It's crazy. I've talked often over the years about chronic inflammation pain in my body. And do I think that the antiperspirant is what's giving me the pain? No. Is it possible that putting aluminum in my armpits every day might have been contributing? Yeah, maybe. Do I think putting aluminum in my armpits every day is a good idea? No. So, I don't know, I'm just saying it out loud because I think that to me, it's actually sort of a significant thing to notice and to identify where it came from. It's like these things get burned in real early, you know? Now, the other thing that came up for me, and a lot of you out there listening, I know are going to relate to this one, is that the time has come for me to get some new photos done. And yoga teachers out there, you know, you get like some photos, like one or two or something to put on your website or whatever. And so after a lot of years, 5 or 6 years, sometimes that needs to get refreshed, I think. You can't just leave that same photo up there forever. So I got to get new photos, and it's brought up so much for me. It's crazy. I mean, I don't know if you would know this, but I grew up in Los Angeles, and I have all of these traumas, I think, this anxieties and ego stuff around looks and appearance and clothing and like trying to decide what I'm going to wear. And then the big question is, am I taking pictures of myself doing poses? Because that's what you're supposed to do, right? And I don't really want to do that. I'm kind of moving away from asanas being this emphasis. I'm not teaching big poses anymore. I'm teaching simple forms. It's like, do we need another picture of me doing down dog? Is that what we have to do to promote ourselves, is to show my body? And I don't know. As you can see, it brings up all this stuff for me. And I'm working through it. I'm creating a process that is fun so that I can move through the difficulty. And I guess all of this does very much relate to today's talk with Dan Coniglio. Dan came to Pennsylvania. He came to my studio in Allentown, and we had a practice. I taught him what I do. And then he taught me some Wim Hof method. We had a Wim Hof session. First, we did this breathing stuff, and then we came back to my house, and I had an ice bath. And then, like right after that, maybe 15, 20 minutes after I finished the ice bath, we recorded this conversation you're going to hear today. And all I'll say about it, I don't want to give anything away, is that I went into it with this idea about shock proteins and cold, and had read stuff about cryotherapy or whatever. So I had kind of gone into it with this idea of kind of like a biohacking thing. But really, it's very philosophical, as you'll hear we discuss. And it was very much about addressing deeply ingrained patterns and kind of blocks that we have so that we can feel more free. And I do think that me getting grips with my underarms and with having to take photos and doing this Wim Hof session was very much about that, about this process of coming to know myself. So, in any case, me and Dan are going to get into it, and I'm excited for you to hear it. Before we do, let me first say something to all of you out there who are trying to make it as a yoga teacher, because I know what it's like to teach a whole bunch of classes at yoga centers. Maybe you work your way up. Maybe you're able to get some primer spots. Maybe you start doing some teacher trainings. At some point, though, you're going to need to set up your own thing. You can't always be working for somebody else because, frankly, there's just not that kind of job security in what we do. And when you're working for yourself and you're starting to set up online stuff, maybe you're doing video calls and stuff, you really do need a way to do credit card processing, to do recurring payments or one-time payments. And there's a lot of different options out there. I have explored almost all of them, but I want to recommend that you use Moonclerk. That is what I'm using. I'm switching over. I've still got a few things like a PayPal button here or there. Sometimes we're still using the Squarespace native, but really, I'm trying to move it all over to Moonclerk because it is by far the best one. So do yourself a favor. If you're using some other platform or some other service to process payments, I really think you might want to consider switching. If you're not using anything yet, I think this is the right place to start. Go to jbrownyoga.com/moonclerk. That's jbrownyoga.com/MOONCLERK. Moonclerk. And make sure to go there first so they know that we sent you. You will be glad that you did. Also, let me mention a few gigs that I have coming up. I am going to be in Falls Church, Virginia, October 5th and 6th at the Yogi Underground. I am going to be in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania at the Namaste Festival, October 26th. You can find out about those gigs and more and all of my stuff at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all, I think that we will just go ahead and get to this talk today. I will touch base with you on the other side about a few things. I do have a very interesting talk coming up next week. We will be revisiting the Ashtanga yoga system next week, and I will tell you more about that, like I said, on the other side. But for now, let's do it. Let's go to my living room in Easton, Pennsylvania, after having just spent 3 minutes in a freezing cold ice bath, and listen to this conversation that I had with Dan Coniglio. Dan, you're in my living room.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I've had a really good day, man.
Me too. I'm so happy to be here. Really happy to be here. It's wonderful.
It's been really fun. I guess I'm curious, why did you reach out to me in the first place?
Because when I was finishing my yoga teacher training is when I met the love of my life, Bree Gregg, and she told me about your podcast. And then somewhere along the way, you moved from New York to here, to Allentown.
Yeah.
And Bree's from Pennsylvania. So Bree came up to me and she said, "You're not going to believe this. Jay moved out of New York. You know, he sold the studio. He moved to Allentown." She's like, "Next time we go visit my family, we got to go see Jay at his studio." I said, "Yeah, absolutely." And I've been listening to the podcast for the last few years. So then we were coming up and we figured, yeah, we're going to drop in. I said, "Hey, I'm going to drop him a line because I've been doing these Wim Hof workshops and maybe he'd be into doing one because I'd love to do one while we're out there." So I dropped you that message and you sent me a response back.
And, you know, it's one of those synchronicities where it was only a few days before where I had been talking, someone had come up, we were talking about Buteyko breathing,
Mm-hmm.
and then I had heard someone talking about Wim Hof and cold and shock proteins or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like really sort of intrigued. And then all of a sudden that email landed in my inbox and I was like, wait a second. Okay, perfect. And I was also thinking about how I wanted to try to record some podcasts that were in person because I've been doing a lot of the phone calls. So it's like, I want to be in the same room with people. So things aligned, and here we are. And I'm curious. This is just for me, but what is it about the show, the podcast, that I don't know made you think I might want to do Wim Hof Method with you or something?
I didn't know if you would.
Yeah,
it was totally. I'm just going to throw it out there, and I do that a lot. I just throw things out there, and sometimes they stick, and sometimes they don't. So I try not to worry too much about what's going to happen. I throw it out there, and there are a lot of yoga people that aren't interested in Wim Hof whatsoever. Aren't interested. You know, hot yoga is pretty popular. Cold yoga, I think we've got a ways to go until we get there.
Well, again, I didn't think of it. I've been talking a lot about how I've come to have a particular idea about what my yoga practice is for me personally. And it has sort of very specific purpose to it. And I understand that a lot of people use yoga poses and yoga practices for other purposes. Mm-hmm. But to me, my yoga practice is very specific. And so I didn't come into this thinking of it as, oh, is this yoga or is this not yoga or anything like that.
Right.
I came into it thinking of it as a different thing, and I've been interested in trying different things. I wanted to put myself in a different situation. And I don't know if I mentioned it to you out there as with as much emphasis as I think it deserves, but I hate cold.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I told my wife that I was doing this, she was like, no way. She didn't even believe I was going to do it. So that 3 minutes out there in that ice bath that I just did with you, it was very significant for me. It was almost like when people run marathons to prove they can do it to themselves or something. I was like, okay, Jay, put your fucking money where your mouth is, man. Instead of making everything easier and trying to down-regulate all the time, you know, and I've been sort of debating people when they come in. Like I remember Gernot Huber came on, and he was using yoga practices in a similar way to like what I think's happening there, where you're almost trying to elicit your stress response, so you can sort of practice how you respond to stresses, almost as like a biohack or something. And I was sort of, because when they were trying to make yoga that, I was like, that's not what yoga is to me. But out there, and with this, it seems to me it is something different. It has its own purpose to it. And I'm curious to like just talk a little bit about like where it comes from. Talk about this guy, Wim Hof. Wim Hof. How do you pronounce his name? Wim Hof. It's not Wim Hof. It's Wim Hof.
Yeah, Wim Hof.
Wim Hof.
Like do it on a whim.
Yeah, on a whim.
Which is kind of
it's pretty much what happened here. So, have you met him in person before?
Yes. Yeah, I have. I met him for the first time when I went to my first workshop. It was with Wim, and it was a big workshop. There was like 200 people there in Toronto. And I was coming from the same place as you. Like, I'm from Canada, but I'm Italian. At least genetically, I'm Italian. And I've always been cold adverse. Wasn't interested in the cold, not interested in skiing, snowboarding. Like, you know, I would catch a cold draft and run diving under my covers and like shiver in the fetal position, you know, just from walking past the door. But I saw this Vice documentary on Wim and him diving under the ice and talking about the cold as this righteous but merciless force, and using nature as his teacher and harnessing the power of the cold and embracing it. And I thought it was nuts, but it got my attention. It was fascinating. And he's such a charismatic and interesting guy, such a passionate guy to listen to. I thought, okay, I think I want to give this a shot. Bree brought me the ticket to the workshop. And like you said, I thought, what have I signed myself up for here? Like, am I really going to do this? What kind of crazy shit is this? But I did it, and I felt great afterwards. And it was something in that overcoming fear, something about not shrinking away from the thing that you normally shrink away from. I thought there was something really valuable in that. And Wim kind of, I think, stumbled upon it. The story goes, as I know it, that he had studied esoteric disciplines from when he was really young. He got into meditation, and he got into yoga and martial arts, Buddhism. And he went really deep with all that stuff. And then he had a really traumatic thing happen in his life. His wife killed herself. And he was in a very dark place, and he had several children to raise on his own as a father. And he said he was walking through Beatrix Park in Amsterdam, and it was in the wintertime, and he saw this patch of water with a little thin layer of ice over top of it. And at this part, like Wim, in the time that I've been around him, like, yes, I did that first workshop with him. I've done trainings with him. I climbed a mountain with him in my shorts, Mount Hood in Portland, Oregon.
In the wintertime, in the cold?
Well, it was in September, but it's cold. It was
cold,
in the mountain. It's still cold on the mountain.
Yeah,
like,
crazy.
The people coming down were looking at us in all their jackets and shoes, and like, you guys are out of your mind. Wow. But he's a very intuitive guy from what I've seen of him so far. I can't say I've spent a ton of time with him, but the trainings I've done with him, he seems like that kind of guy. And that's what he did. He said he felt drawn to this patch of cold water, this ice water, and he just stripped down in the park into his shorts and got in and started hyperventilating, which is what happens when you hit the cold water. But he stayed with it, and he stayed with it, and he got out, and he felt fantastic. He felt refreshed and revitalized, and he thought, okay, there's something to this, and kept going back to that same patch, staying in there and training and training and training. And he observed that way he was breathing. And eventually he took that breathing method out of the cold water and developed it as its own thing, probably combined with all his knowledge of pranayama and everything like that, and developed this specific breathing technique.
Huh. And has he said more than about why he thought to jump into that water? Like,
nope.
It's just a whim.
Yeah, a whim, a total whim. He just follows what he feels drawn towards, whatever that is. He's a very in the moment kind of guy. From what I've seen, he doesn't seem like he's in his head or overthinking, overanalyzing kind of fella.
And he made some connection between the life situation of him being faced with the loss of his wife and having to raise these kids on his own. Mm-hmm. And this process he went through with cold and what was happening with his breath.
Yeah, he says that the cold was a healer for him. The cold was a healer, and the cold was a teacher, and it helped him overcome that difficulty. And then he started refining it and doing more and more with it and spending more and more time with it. Then he was able to get all these records, like longest time in an ice bath, nearly 2 hours submerged up to his neck in ice, running a half marathon in his bare feet in a polar circle. And there's video of this stuff, like all over YouTube. Like you can find video of this stuff.
Yeah. I've certainly know that sometimes people, a lot of whatever, more like extreme sports or whatever, is a lot of overcoming perceived limitations, whatnot. But it sounds to me that this is being presented more as utilizing cold as a vehicle for both like a certain mental thing. But there's absolutely, like, I'm sitting here right now and I still have kind of tingle on from it. Mm-hmm. And like here's the thing that I didn't tell you, that I had like a panic moment in the ice bath. And the panic moment was because there were like pain areas in my body, like my hips and my sacroiliac joint and some in my lower limbs. And I was feeling those areas like very intensely in the ice bath. And it scared me because normally pain sensations from those areas are a signal for me to stop doing whatever I'm doing, because I've normally been doing things to aggravate those areas.
Yeah.
But so there was like a panic moment, but there was a whole process of a mental thing right there, like a facing of a fear and a trusting in an innate ability of my body and myself in the universe. And now I'm sitting here, and those are areas that were like they were definitely inflamed in the last few days, and they're not at all inflamed right now. Certainly an ice bath will take down inflammation probably in and of itself.
Yeah.
But it's that combination. The reason I say all that is because there's a physical thing that was happening, but there was more of a subtle mental engagement or activity that had to happen. And I think that's the kind of the philosophical part of it.
Yeah. Wim talks about the terrorists of the mind, and that these terrorists are fear, anxiety, depression, living in the past, like being attached to something terrible that happened to you previously, or being in fear of something terrible that's going to happen to you in the future. And it's so common now. Like, it's really common. I hear the word anxiety on a daily basis, and this isn't a word that I heard that often before. So Wim is teaching this as a way to deal with that. and to get out of those mindsets, because this is a huge part of it, is the mindset. And the thing about the cold is it's not a problem that you can solve with your mind. You can't think your way out of being cold. Like, it just doesn't work.
You can't stop it. You're in there. It's cold.
Yeah. So, and I think it's really healthy for the body to come up against situations that it can't rely on the mind to solve. We have to allow the body to solve it, and the body knows how to solve the problem of the cold if we give it the opportunity to. Of course, there's limitations, and we're playing with these boundaries, how far to go. But, what we did today, you spent 3 minutes in there, which was fantastic for the first time in an ice bath. I mean, you don't do cold showers. You say you're cold averse, and you sat in there for 3 minutes. And without the mind, coming into it, you just have to let the body do what it knows how to do.
There is a discipline involved for sure. That's already been cultivated, I think. But wow, I just think you said something earlier today about how we never experience cold even, and it really struck me.
Yeah.
Whenever I'm cold to a certain point, I would always be immediately remedying that.
Yeah, that's the way most of us have grown accustomed to being. Is life was tough for a really long time. We were out there exposed to nature, and nature is beautiful and incredible, and nature wants to keep you alive, and it also wants to kill you.
Yes.
Like, there's both sides going on in nature.
Yes.
And we lived out there in harsh, real nature for a long time, and it was difficult and it was challenging. And then we came up with innovations. We created shelter, we created clothing, we created air conditioning, we created heat, we created all these things. And now all we're being sold is comfort. We're just constantly watch television. I barely watch television. We watched it last night, and every commercial is geared towards making you more comfortable. How to make you more comfortable, how to take the magic pill, how to take, eat the food that's just going to make you happy instead of the food that's going to make you healthy. So I think we've gone too far with the comfort. And I'm not saying comfort's bad. We were talking earlier today about, is this good? Is this bad? It's how you use it. Comfort is a wonderful thing, man. I love air conditioning sometimes. I love the heat coming on sometimes. But the cold is something very uncomfortable. And we've developed all these ways to avoid it with the heating, with the clothes. So we now don't expose ourselves to the cold. And there's something happening in the vascular system. When you expose yourself to the cold, the vascular system is constricting. So all your circulation, everything is constricting. All the blood is getting drawn up into the torso, away from the extremities, because your body's intelligent, and it knows that you can live without fingers and toes, but you can't live without a heart and lungs. So it pulls all the blood into the torso to keep you alive, and this vasoconstriction happens. So if we never expose ourselves to the cold, we're missing a whole range of motion in the vascular system. We're only getting half of the picture. The vascular system is getting this shortened range of motion. And if as yoga people, we want to, have the best range of motion possible, maybe it's worth exploring getting cold.
Well, Amy Matthews, who's on this show a couple of times, she talks about having the full range of movement possibility available to you. And sometimes I think she's even offered that as sort of a definition of health, like the full range of movement possibility available to you. And I've sometimes even talked about it in terms of emotions. Like, I used to have this idea of healthy meaning I would feel happy, but actually healthy would be the full range of emotions, including the ones that I don't like or wish to not experience. So in what you're saying, in terms of our experience of temperature, we've insulated ourselves so much in our comfortable modern lives that we don't actually experience a full range of temperature. We never actually experience cold.
And isn't that what you want? I mean, that's what I want. I want to be able to have access to as much as possible. Like you said, the access to the full emotional range, because people say anger is bad. Is it? Sometimes anger can be really beneficial. Sometimes you can use it to fuel you to do great things. So it's how we use these things. And I personally want to have access to as much of it as possible. Just like in music, you're a musician and I'm a musician. And I think of the frequency range in music. Like when you look at an EQ from bass all the way to treble, like how much of that frequency range do you want to use? Do you want to use just half of it? Like you're missing out on a lot of information. Mm-hmm. And, is bass bad? Is 50 kilohertz bad? Is 100 hertz bad? Like, no, it's how you use it to adjust the mix that you like the sound of. How do you like your mix to sound? And your mix is going to sound a little bit different than my mix, and that's cool. That's what makes the world go round and makes it a beautiful place to be, is all the diversity. But I definitely want to open myself up to as much of the range as possible.
And I mean, were you always that way? Or, you said you were a musician first, right? You studied music, you told me.
Yeah.
And you're a bass player.
Yeah.
When did you first get into yoga?
I got into yoga late. I was an unathletic person for most of my life. In my early childhood years, I was a chubby kid, last kid around the block. And when in gym class, when we go running around the block, like never got any sports teams. That's why I became a musician. That's why a lot of us became musicians, because like we weren't.
That's the only way you could get girls, right?
Yeah, we had to get attention somehow. So I turned to music, and then I'd been a professional musician for a while, and around the age of 30, I really hadn't done much to take care of my body. Mm. And a few friends had recommended yoga to me, told me about yoga. And it sounded like that would be something that would be cool to try. And it just happened that a hot yoga studio, Modo Yoga in Markham, opened down the street from me, which is where I teach now.
And that was in Toronto?
Yeah, this is in Markham. So this is north of Toronto.
Okay.
But this hot yoga studio opened down the street. So I went to it and I gave it a shot. And I was pretty overweight at the time. So I went and gave it a shot, and it felt really satisfying to have this like puddle of sweat underneath me at the end of class. But what really drew me in was the way the teachers spoke, because they had this gentle approach that I had never encountered in physical activity. Normally it was like push and go hard and don't be a such and such. So to hear that gentler approach, like, hey, go as far as you like. You don't have to push too far. Like, you can take a break when you need to. But also the mindful portion of it, because I had just read Eckhart Tolle's A New Earth and discovered breath and the present moment, like introduced to this concept of it.
And sometimes at Modo they have live music. Did they have live music at your spot too?
Yes. Thank you for saying that. This is where we're going, because I did the hot classes for a while. And then one guy said to me, one of my fellow students said, hey man, there's this Friday night class. It's this man and the woman, husband and wife. She teaches the yoga and he plays music. And like, they ring chimes in your ears and it's really cool. You got to try it out. And I mean, I was coming from a pretty cynical, skeptical place at the time. I'm like, I don't know about this. So I went to the class, and this was Yumi Chung and Scott Peterson. Yumi Chung, was my teacher for a long time and now my friend, as is Scott. But at that first class, I heard Yumi talking about bandhas and energetic locks, and I just thought, are these hippies full of shit? Like, is this for real? I don't know if I'm on board with this. But I did the class, and Scott's music was so beautiful and Yumi's teaching was so beautiful. I couldn't doubt that I felt something really deep, touching me. So I kept going back to that class, and then that class became like a very healing place for me to go. I went every Friday night, 6:30, and like I said, became friends with them, and they opened all kinds of doors for me. It was because of them that I went to Bali on my very first yoga retreat with them, which was an incredible thing to do. If anyone listening out there hasn't been on a yoga retreat, wow, what a wonderful thing to do.
And I think Bali is also a very specific place for it. It's because there's all kinds of different retreats, but Bali has its own special character, it seems.
Definitely does.
What year was it when you started going to that Modo? What time frame are we talking about?
That was probably, it's 2019 this year, so that was probably around around 10, 12 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe 12 years ago, around that time. So, and it was a really kind of up and down thing for me. My practice wavered dramatically over the years. There were times where I'd be practicing really intensely. Like, I know some people are like, once I found yoga, I went whole, not me. I was
you had the music thing
up and down. Yeah, I had music happening too, my life as a musician, but hanging out with Scott and Yumi was really inspiring, really changed my lifestyle, and eventually inspired me to become a teacher. And Yumi recommended a few places to go for my teacher training. Mm-hmm. And I did that, and I studied pranayama. And then eventually...
Wait. I want to ask you about that retreat. You said everybody should go on a retreat. Why? What was it about that retreat that was so important to you?
Oh, okay. Because previous to that retreat, anytime I had gone on vacation, I would go somewhere where I would eat too much, drink too much alcohol, probably smoke too much, and come back feeling worse than when I had left. But on that retreat, we just ate vegetarian food for an entire week and out in beautiful nature and no alcohol and just healthy movement and great conversations with wonderful people.
Yes. Amazing what that does, right?
And I felt so good. I thought, really? Life can be this fun without doing dirty, terrible things to myself?
But that's so important. I had the same thing because I had other things that I was doing before yoga, whatever, partying or drugs or whatever, that at some point it was exactly like you just said, where, wait, these activities make me feel a way that I want to feel. Mm-hmm. And these other activities, while they provide some seeming relief, at least temporarily in the immediate, they have all these backlashes that I then have to spend all this effort to deal with. Mm-hmm. And these pure things like playing a bass guitar or going to a yoga class, those didn't have those. Those had just win-win situations most of the time. Yeah, the overwhelming majority of the time. And interestingly enough, after I finished that retreat and I was at the peak of feeling great, I went to Hong Kong to visit my buddy Mark, who was waiting for me at the airport to pick me up with a rum and Coke in his hand. And he put it in my hand. He's like, dude, I don't care what you've been doing for the last week. We're going out and ripping it up tonight. And we did. Yeah. We ripped it up hard. We did all the stuff. Yeah. Old time's sake, eh?
Yeah. Coming back on the boat in Hong Kong, at 3 a.m. And I woke up the next morning feeling terrible, but it was perfect. It was exactly what I needed to see. Here's what feels good. Here's what feels really bad. And I'm not saying don't ever drink or anything like that. I like to have a beer as much as the next person, but it's not overindulging. I don't go to the lengths of overindulgence that I did before.
Yeah, I think at a certain point I just prioritized how I feel, and getting aware of that, and then having awareness about what the things that I'm doing and eating and people I'm spending time with and how all of that was affecting how I felt. Mm-hmm. And then if I made certain choices about those things, I get to feel more the way I want to feel more of the time. Yeah. Fancy that. See, that's what yoga practice, I think, is about in many regards, is developing that kind of just facility of managing yourself. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and when you find those people in your life, when you find those people that make you feel great, spend time with those people. Even if they're people that aren't in your physical world, even if it's a podcaster, if they make you feel good, spend time with that podcast, because the people you spend time with have a huge influence on your day-to-day well-being.
Isn't that the truth? And just sometimes, I've said this before, I think we need models. You need to meet somebody and see certain qualities or characteristics in them that you would then emulate. Be like, yes, I like that quality in that person. I like the way they are, the way they handle themselves, the way they communicate, or whatever it is. And then you get to say, oh, I want to bring more of whatever I'm liking in that person into who I am.
Yeah, I think most of us need that example to follow. We need to see someone get over the fence to know that it's possible.
They did it. I can do it.
I can do it too. Yeah. And some people can do it on their own. Wim.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.